Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the kind introduction, and also to the group for the invitation to join you today. I'm very much looking forward, especially to the discussion to follow what I'm about to present. I also am relieved to hear that there are at least a number of you who have investments in Schelling. I decided to select this in part because it's situated in a larger project that I'm working on right now, which involves, among other things, reassessing the contemporary relevance of German idealist philosophies of nature, especially as per Schelling and Hegel, for current concerns in what we might refer to broadly as contemporary metaphysics in the European tradition. And of course, this is also of a piece with my larger ongoing effort to reassess the legacy of German idealism for today. So I'll lay out what I have to lay out, which should take about 45 to 50 minutes. And then after that, I assume we can go as long as we need to, in terms of the discussion to follow. So let me then get well and truly underway. Antonio Gramsci, at one point in his prison notebooks, alights upon a serious problem for any sort of radical monism or immanentism. Given Gramsci's combined theoretical and practical concerns as a Marxist thinker and activist, he addresses this problem insofar as it affects certain variants of historical materialism. He has in view, apropos this difficulty, the reductive economism of such late 19th and early 20th century orientations as the Second International, German social democracy, and the more mechanistic strains of Bolshevism. Gramsci alleges that all agents in a given socioeconomic system would be, for a pseudo-Marxist economistic monism, so immanent to this system as to be direct instantiations of this system's groups. These groups would be, first and foremost, the classes composing a class-divided society. From the perspective of the economistic reductivism problematized by Gramsci, individual actors would be nothing but embodiments of the interests of the classes to which they belong. They would behave unerringly in accordance with these interests. Yet, the past and present are littered with examples of individual actors erring in relation to their class, failing to act in accordance with what would be objectively in the material interests of the group to which they belong. Sadly, many of the examples that most readily spring to mind are of exploited and oppressed segments of societies deviating from and undermining their own interests through conducting themselves in conformity with the diametrically opposed interests of their exploiters and oppressors. In this vein, Gramsci, focusing instead on mistakes made by members of ruling classes, remarks, quote, "A particular political act may have been an error of calculation on the part of the leaders of the dominant classes, an error that historical development corrects and moves beyond through the governmental parliamentary crises of the ruling classes. Mechanical historical materialism does not take the possibility of error into account. It assumes that every political act is determined directly by the structure and is therefore the reflection of a real and permanent, in the sense of secured, modification of the structure. The principle of error is complex. It could consist in an individual impulse stemming from a mistaken calculation, or it could also be the manifestation of the attempts, which may fail, of specific groups or cliques to attain hegemony within the leading group," end quote. Gramsci's phrase, mechanical historical materialism, refers to reductive economism. As he points out, if, according to such a monism/immanentism, persons within a society are simply immediate expressions of this society's infrastructure, its economic base, then their thinking and acting cannot ever involve making mistakes vis-a-vis their economic agendas, identities, and positions. The iron chains of causal determination by a given mode of production, with its classed relations of production, would keep each and every singular subject unwaveringly in line with these subjects' class positions and accompanying interests. Thus, as Gramsci insightfully observes, the reductive economism of vulgarized historical materialism cannot account for errors as instances in which there are discrepancies between, on the one hand, subjective thinking and or acting, and on the other hand, objective class status. Such flattening economistic monism leaves no space for the gaps of such discrepancies to arise. This leaves it with no explanation for the types of mistakes alluded to in the above quotation from the prison notebooks. One of Mao Zedong's essays famously asks, where do correct ideas come from? Gramsci's question here amounts to wondering, where do incorrect ideas come from? I will not be sorting out here the issues raised specifically for Marxist historical materialism by Gramsci's invocation of mistakes, miscalculations, and the like. Instead, I bring up this moment in his prison notebooks with an eye to how the Gramscian problem of error theoretically undermines any and all extreme monisms or immanentisms. In particular, I see this Gramsci as reflecting on a challenge already confronting post-Kantian German idealism. Of the German idealists, this challenge is perhaps most troubling for Schelling, especially in connection with Schelling's more Spinozistic leanings, as manifest in, for instance, his early philosophy of identity, but also on display across the full arc of his intellectual itinerary. An 1806 text critiquing Fichte contains a moment in which Schelling formulates his own version of the problem of error, or error itself as a major philosophical problem. Therein, he states, quote, "We recognize it to be the greatest puzzle that knowledge is subsequent to being or seeks after it as something later, as if there could be a being that is not self-revelation, or as if living being could be something other than self-affirmation," end quote. Schelling goes on to describe this as the quote unquote puzzle of all puzzles. This same text later identifies quote unquote the great question as being raised by the truth, quote, that splitting and division in fact occur in reality, end quote. The surfacing of this greatest puzzle of puzzles in the context of an anti-Fichtean polemic arguably is no accident. Schelling's embrace of Spinoza is strongest when his holding of Fichte at arm's length is at its most vehement. That is to say, Schelling tends to emphasize and reinforce his break with Fichte as an anti-naturalist transcendental idealist, in part by doubling down on his Spinozism as naturalistic monism. This is evident starting with Schelling's public declaration of his rupture with his former mentor, namely 1801's presentation of My System of Philosophy, a treatise whose geometric method, as well as its conceptual content, deliberately echoes Spinoza's ethics. Schelling's Naturphilosophie, and even more so his Identitätsphilosophie, both take shape in the late 1790s and early 1800s. Both of them face the topic of error as a fundamental metaphysical problem. They do so precisely because of their affirmations of a radical monism, in which everything is immanent to a unique one-all. The influence of Spinoza here intermingles with Eleatic and Neoplatonic sources too. Schelling utilizes a range of names for this one-all, including nature, God, substance, absolute, identity, indifference, and infinity. But as soon as one adopts such a monism, a disturbing enigma promptly arises, an enigma described in the above quotation from Schelling's 1806 statement on the true relationship of the philosophy of nature to the revised Fichtean doctrine. This kind of monist, if he or she is a rigorous and consequent philosopher, must come to wonder why errors ever occur in the first place. By contrast, for a dualist subscribing to a picture of existence in which subjective mind is partitioned from objective world, the human capacity for truth, rather than for falsity, is the greatest puzzle, with modern epistemological thinking from Descartes to Gettier and beyond testifying to the intimate bond between dualistic worldviews and the metaphysical prioritization of true knowledge as one of philosophy's key problems, if not the problem of all philosophical problems. For a standard modern epistemologist, the big question is, how does the mind connect with the world so as to really know the latter? Or asked differently, how does the subject bridge the divide between itself and the object in order to become truly acquainted and familiar with the object as it actually is in and of itself? However, as some of Schelling's work reveals, the big metaphysical epistemological line of questioning for a committed, consistent monist is the opposite of that for any dualist. On the one hand, the dualist is left wondering how, if at all, the gap between minded subjectivity and worldly objectivity is ever successfully crossed. On the other hand, the monist is forced to consider how this very same division and the possibilities for error as subjective mind erring from objective world it generates, how this very division emerges in the first place out of a presumably undivided being, grounding of and common to both mind and world, both subjects and objects. That is, a being such as the Schellingian absolute or indifference. A dualist ontology leads to a preoccupation with truth as an epistemological difficulty. A monist ontology leads to a confrontation with error as an ontological as well as epistemological mystery. It is correct to emphasize that for Schelling, metaphysics as ontology enjoys priority over epistemology. And the epistemology conditioned by Schelling's ontology would have to be not only, as Beiser adds, a quote unquote naturalistic epistemology, but one for which the false instead of the true is the ultimate riddle for a theory of knowledge, or we might say of non-knowledge. Similarly, Wolfram Hochgrabe claims that Schelling effectively recasts epistemology as cosmology. If so, if knowledge is a matter of the universe coming to perceive and conceptualize itself, then the real conundrum has to do with those instances in which the cosmos fails to grasp itself, in which it becomes estranged from and opaque to itself. Monism demands asking, how can an ontology insisting upon the exhaustive and inescapable immanence of all beings to a soul being with a capital B, license a corresponding epistemology, allowing falsehoods as discrepancies with or distortions of this being to transpire in the guises of mistakes, misapprehensions, misunderstandings, etc. If there ultimately is only the pure lone one-all, why would it not dwell in undiluted truth, in the undimmed light of error-free, quote-unquote, self-revelation and quote-unquote self-affirmation, as Schelling uses these terms in a preceding quotation that I read aloud a little earlier. Being of extreme monism / immanentism even bothers to self-relate to begin with. This itself is a quandary, sometimes prompting Schelling to criticize Spinoza for neither confronting nor resolving it. Why would this being not automatically and invariably enjoy full transparency to itself? Since in its absolute infinitude it has no other, what possibly could interfere with and cloud over its self-reflection, rendering the latter inaccurate, false, or incoherent? Apropos Spinoza's metaphysics, and Schelling when he periodically embraces it very tightly, even if one grants that the dualism of the attributes of thinking and extension and the plurality of these attributes' modes are merely apparent, qua illusory, in relation to the underlying ontological oneness of substance as Deus sive natura, it still must be queried why and or how such appearances and illusions ever arise at all. Schelling brushes up against this same set of queries. In 1830, he portrays the creation of the world with its finite determinate beings as God putting himself into doubt, as the divine becoming obscure to and uncertain of itself. This should immediately prompt questions about why and or how the deity ever would bother to muddy its own waters, to introduce truth eclipsing and knowledge thwarting distortions, illusions, mirages, and the like within itself. In 1841 to 1842, Schelling himself wonders aloud, quote, if reason is all being in everything that has being, then where does unreason, which is admixed with all being, come from? End quote. In the 1811 first draft of the unfinished Weltalter project, Schelling once again alludes to the topic of error. Specifically, he there, albeit in passing, associates human freedom with being, quote unquote, exposed to error. The reasoning behind this association is based on the idea that the autonomy and self-determination of singular subjects is ontologically made possible by these subjects individuating themselves through emerging out of and partially detaching from pre- or non-subjective substances as nature with its physical, chemical, and organic strata. For Schelling, such subject-creating individuation essentially involves the genesis of a self-relating point of contraction, striving to sever its links to and dependence upon the rest of interconnected transsubjective being. This contractive striving, through its willful turning inward and away from anything outer, renders its own ontological origins and surroundings opaque to itself. It comes to see what is outward through a subjective glass darkly. This depiction of humanity's liberty provides Schelling with justification for a theoretical epistemological explanation of error, as well as a practical ethical explanation of evil. Indeed, Schelling's related accounts of both error and evil are rooted in core features of his fundamental ontology. In 1804, in anticipating the ground existence distinction of 1809's Freiheitsschrift, he stipulates that, quote, no individual entity contains the ground for its existence in itself, end quote. According to this ontological stipulation, a transindividual being makes possible and gives rise to individuated beings, with the latter including singular human subjects. While such beings and subjects depend on this being, the latter does not depend on the former. Then, in 1806's Aphorisms to Introduce the Philosophy of Nature, Schelling declares that, quote, the sole and authentic sin is existence itself, end quote. The unique proper sin is, as it were, the primordial lapse into the proper itself. That is to say, this Urfault is nothing other than the collapse of the transindividual ground of the substance of being into the individual existence of the being of the subject. In Schelling's speculative philosophical recasting of the biblical narrative of the fall of original sin, individuation is in fact, the necessary evil. And in line with this religious narrative, the finite subject's estrangement from infinite substance as its progenitor, both, one, opens up the space of human freedom as enabling the possibilities for good and evil alike, as well as, two, is requisite for any eventual reconciliation and redemption between the creature and its creator, with this suggesting that the future highest good is made possible by a past primal evil. We're already to discern here the convergence within Schelling's ontology of individuation of theoretical, metaphysical, and practical ethical dimensions. The ontological becoming finite of the infinite as the becoming subject of substance involves erring at the level of both of these dimensions. At the theoretical metaphysical level, ontological individuation leads to thinking's epistemological errors. It's going astray as regards being. At the practical ethical level, the contraction into ipseity enables acting's moral errors, in which the subject selfishly conducts itself as though it owed nothing to the inter and transsubjective relations actually engendering and sustaining it. All of this is confirmed by and developed in Schelling's celebrated 1809 Freiheitsschrift, with its account of evil as a positive ontological reality unto itself. Therein, Schelling associates evil, including that of the original sin of the ontologically fundamental primordial fall into individuation itself, with ravenous selfishness. Driven by its essential and characteristic blind hunger, evil seeks perversely to avert the relation between ground and existence, Grund und Existenz, by affirming the primacy of the latter over the former. Evil is agency run amok, deliberately trying, albeit in vain, to gain control over the ontological conditions of agency itself, with these conditions being forever refractory to any such control. As Schelling puts this in his roughly contemporaneous Clara dialogue, evil is at root always a matter of an attempt to turn the conditioned or conditional as finite, created, produced, subject, existence, etc., to turn this into the unconditioned or unconditional as infinite, creating, producing, substance, ground, etc. That is, to stand things on their head and make the tail wag the dog. And in another text from the same period, 1810's Stuttgart Seminars, he observes, quote, "It could indeed be argued that evil itself proves perhaps the most spiritual phenomenon yet, for it wages the most vehement war against all being. Indeed, it wishes to destroy the very ground of all creation," end quote. He soon adds, quote, "Evil is in its own way something pure," end quote. Insofar as evil is epitomized by human subjectivity trying to break away from and assert its supreme sovereignty over the substance of natural being from which it arises in the first place, this rebellion against the ground of impure materiality indicates a striving towards pure spirituality inherent to the very essence of evil as the middle period Schelling conceives it. The Freiheitsschrift also has recourse to the metaphor of disease in its treatment of the topic of evil. This metaphor, one Hegel too utilizes in manners similar to Schelling, reinforces the convergence of Schelling's accounts of evil as practical ethical erring and error as theoretical epistemological erring. These twin accounts both are grounded in his underlying metaphysics of the individuation of many beings out of one being and the anthropogenesis of human transcendental subjectivity out of the immanence of natural substance. The Schelling of 1809 says of illness, quote, "Even particular disease emerges only because that which has its freedom or life, only so that it may remain in the whole, strives to be for itself. As disease is admittedly nothing having inherent being, really only an apparent picture of life and merely a meteoric appearance of it, an oscillation between being and non-being, yet announces itself nevertheless as something very real to feeling. So it is with evil," end quote. Schelling wavers between positive and privative depictions of sickness, between illness as a reality unto itself versus as a mere lack of health, respectively. And this, despite the focus of the Freiheitsschrift on developing a positive rather than a privative conception of evil. This wavering attests to the lingering attraction for Schelling of a radical monism inspired by a combination of Eleatic, Neoplatonic, and Spinozistic sensibilities. This is precisely the sort of monism that makes error into, as Schelling himself admits in 1806, the puzzle of all puzzles. Whether Schelling has a solution to this riddle remains to be seen. That said, the rendition of illness in the preceding quotation audibly resonates with Schelling's fundamental ontology of individuation. For Schelling, a disease is an instance in which an organ rebelliously frees itself from its subordinate position within an organism, so as improperly to attempt to impose itself as the governing center of the entire organism. This is a mereological revolt in which a part strives to assert the whole. Cancerous organs would be paradigmatic of sickness generally in Schelling's eyes. Moreover, the identification of the essence of illness, of erring from health, as based in a part's self-freeing vis-a-vis the whole to which it belongs, permits Schelling to associate illness with practical ethical autonomy and self-determination. It also permits me further to associate illness a la Schelling with theoretical epistemological error too. In 1821, the later Schelling makes this further association himself, establishing a chain of equivalence between error, evil, and illness. In the 1841 to 1842 Berlin lectures on the philosophy of revelation, he likewise pairs error and sickness as both privations that nonetheless are not nothing. In like diseases, excessive egotistical willfulness, and mistaken notions about reality alike, a mere moment somehow detaches itself from its foundational and encompassing ontological / metaphysical basis and introduces a topsy-turvy disorder by thrusting itself forward as the ruling principle of all. Both freedom as freedom for evil as well as good, and falsehood as ideational deviation from what is the case, are, from a Schellingian perspective, cancers on being. The human subjectivity central to both practical and theoretical philosophy is the cancer of creation. Moreover, if Schelling's practical philosophy could be described as an evil first ethics, with the fall into contractive self-determinacy as the primordial sin, uniquely enabling eventual reconciliation and redemption, then his theoretical philosophy likewise could be branded an error-first ontology, with the erring of individuation bringing with it the risk of errors as symptoms of discrepancies between ground and existence, substance and subject. In addition to Schelling's above discussed remarks about error in his statement on the true relationship of the philosophy of nature to the revised Fichtean doctrine, and aphorisms to introduce the philosophy of nature, both from 1806, this topic also receives important treatment in his 1821 On the Nature of Philosophy as a Science, that is the so-called Erlangen lessons. Therein, Schelling explicitly confirms my exegetical hunches spelled out above in connection with his 1806 reflections on error and immediately subsequent related speculations in the Freiheitsschrift, Stuttgart Seminars, and Clara Dialogue. To begin with, On the Nature of Philosophy as a Science blames subjects falling into error on their inherent autonomous volition, on a quote unquote sheer will to know. The original underlying epistemic ill is nothing other than the will. Human freedom is not only being free for evil as well as good, it also likewise is being free for the false as well as the true. If freedom is a positive reality, then error as a symptom of it, like evil too, is not the pure negative of a mere absence of knowledge, or with evil, a simple privation of or distance from goodness. In the same 1821 context, the primary mistake which subjects are free willfully to commit, a foul frequently called out by Schelling throughout his corpus, is the modern philosophical sin of dualism. More precisely, Schelling faults the separation of the natural from the supernatural for opening up the space for a proliferation of human, all too human falsehoods, fantasies, fictions, illusions, mistakes, and the like. This ur-dualism is the primordial form for all vertical dualistic distinctions between the low and the high, the immanent and the transcendent, the this worldly and the otherworldly, etc. Although monism must confront itself with the challenge of self-consistently accounting for error, dualism as anti-monism is itself already erroneous without knowing itself to be so. Anti-monism would be one of the errors, if not the error of errors, for monism itself to explain. The later Schelling's Erlangen lectures add a crucial ingredient to his attempted monistic explanation of error. Therein, Schelling points to the quote-unquote struggle of an original quote-unquote inner conflict between quote-unquote spiritual forces. This turmoil within the mind of the individual subject is itself said by Schelling to be an outgrowth of deeper pre-individual strife. Although not entirely clear at this moment, somehow such strife engenders the errors to which humans are prone. As I will go on to argue, this just highlighted ingredient added to the Schellingian account of mistakes in 1821 retroactively brings to light a fundamental fault line of tension perturbing Schelling's thinking from the late 1790s onward. Schelling frequently, throughout his career, leans into a more Eleatic, Neoplatonic, and/or Spinozistic, all is one, Henkai Pan monism, emphasizing identity, oneness, unity, and so on. But he sometimes, starting in 1797's Ideas for a Philosophy of Nature, favors instead a very different sort of monism, one that fairly could be labeled a conflict ontology. Although still monistic, this ontology of conflict stresses antagonism, contradiction, discord, opposition, and the like, as opposed to privileging identity, etc. Indeed, I would claim that Schelling's periodic endorsements of a conflict ontology testify, however inadvertently or not, to the fact that the problem of error is irresolvable within the parameters of any Henkai Pan monism, including Schelling's own philosophy of identity, as well as certain permutations of his philosophy of nature. The making of mistakes is not only the greatest puzzle of all puzzles for a metaphysics of a fundamental ultimate one-all, it is simply unsolvable for such a metaphysics. In the context of this talk, I will be skipping over the exegetical details of my reconstruction of the waverings between Henkai Pan and conflict ontologies across the lengthy span of Schelling's corpus. Suffice it to note that in this reconstruction, I pinpoint the 1815 third and final draft of the unfinished Weltalter project as perhaps the lone instance in which Schelling fully and unambiguously embraces a radical conflict ontology closer in inspiration to the likes of Empedocles and Heraclitus than to the Eleatics or the Neoplatonists. I now wish to outline a contemporary reactualization of a Schellingian compatibilism between transcendental philosophy and naturphilosophy, informed by the criticisms of Schelling I've unfolded throughout the proceeding as well as elsewhere. I will conclude with a series of 9 points for a philosophical agenda that perhaps appropriately could be labeled the latest system program of German idealism, in homage to the earliest system program of German idealism of 1796. In the spirit, but not to the letter of Schelling's Oeuvre, I am preoccupied with the task of reconciling a naturalistic fundamental ontology with a transcendentalist theory of subjectivity. The opening 3 of these 9 programmatic points have to do with Spinoza's Deus sive natura. First, Schelling treats this or as an inclusive disjunction. In so doing, he allows himself to equivocate between the divine and the natural. Modern scientific sensibility suggests that Spinoza's or, God or nature, should be treated instead as an exclusive disjunction. Second, these same sensibilities also call for choosing natura over deus, especially when the latter abets the infusion of unobservable occult forces and mysterious powers into nature. By contrast with Schelling's pseudo-naturalistic spiritualism, his hylozoism, panpsychism, pantheism, and/or vitalism, any recognizably and properly naturalistic position, taking seriously the methodologies and epistemologies, as well as the contents of the empirical experimental natural sciences, must forego appeals to God, the unexplained explainer, and related notions enshrined in theological dogmas and religious beliefs, however sublimated or disguised. Third, in line with the epistemological, methodological constraints of the modern natural sciences, nature must be understood strictly as natura naturata, so as to avoid simply replacing scientific investigation with philosophical visions. Nature must not, as Schelling does, be redoubled as a purportedly more fundamental metaphysical natura naturans. Schelling's distinction between an empirical physics dealing with natura naturata as knowable a posteriori and a higher speculative physics dealing with natura naturans knowable a priori invites countless flights of fancy, projecting themselves onto or eclipsing and disregarding altogether the data and outcomes of lowly, non-speculative scientific activities. Schelling himself, especially in his more overtly theosophical later years, is guilty of and epitomizes this danger of the speculative separating from and then interfering with the empirical. Already in the 1804 Würzburg course on Naturphilosophy, Schelling castigates empirical physics for mechanistically devitalizing nature, for the reduction of living dynamic natura naturans to dead inert natura naturata. Schelling's hylozoistic, vitalistic image of nature in its grand totality as a cosmic mega-organism deserves to be left by the historical wayside. I am sympathetic to his insistence in the face of the Kant of the Critique of the Power of Judgment, that the teleological intentions, plans, and purposes of living beings are not just a Kantian regulative idea, namely, that final causes really are operative in Natur an sich. But Schelling here falls back on a false dilemma. He pits his universe as organism, in which his ontologization of Kant's conception of natural teleology in the third critique is absolutized for nature as a whole. He pits his universe as organism as ostensibly the sole alternative to the Newtonian universe as mechanism, with mechanical physics informing the picture of nature integral to Kant's critique of pure reason, a picture in which the natural contains efficient but not final causes. This false dilemma readily can be circumvented by recognizing that nature in itself actually is composed of varied regions, with certain of its levels and layers being inorganic and others being organic. One need not be compelled to decide between either everything being mechanical, excuse me, or everything being alive. Both of these options deserve to be condemned and dismissed as indefensibly one-sided. Fifth, nature not only, in line with point 4 above, is stratified into irreducible to each other dimensions, inorganic, organic, physical, chemical, biological, and so on. This already is to reverse Schelling's tendency to prioritize identity over difference. But through interfacing and secularizing his 1797 to 1799 Naturphilosophy, with its ontologization of the Kant of 1786's metaphysical foundations of natural science, as well as Schelling's 1815 Weltalter manuscript, one arrives at a reconceptualization of nature according to which, in addition to there being intranatural non-antagonistic differences, there are also intranatural antagonistic negativities. This leads to a naturalistic conflict ontology in which various collisions, discrepancies, frictions, oppositions, tensions, and the like configure and agitate material being and its outgrowths, up to and including the sapient human subject as per Transcendental Idealism. Schelling's reliance upon Kant's attractive and repulsive forces often prompts him to depict the intranatural negativities of a conflict ontological version of the philosophy of nature as clashing energies and forces. Yet, as Schelling himself readily would admit, nature's inner conflicts are not limited to the level of such inorganic natural phenomena as electricity, gravity, light, and magnetism. That is, those phenomena of special interest to the young Schelling of the late 1790s in connection with the Kant of metaphysical foundations of natural science. Especially through taking into consideration natural scientific developments postdating Schelling's death, the domains of organic nature, too, show themselves to be traversed by conflicts, examples of which include the evolutionary struggle for survival of a Darwinian nature red in tooth and claw, the incompatible jockeying interests and motivations within organisms as divided between, on the one hand, being members of species with these species genetic determinants, and on the other, being somatic and even psychical individuals with their own idiosyncratic particular concerns, tugs of war between sexual and self-preservative tendencies, as well as between amorous and aggressive inclinations, the discordant interactions between regions and subregions of central nervous systems, sandwiching together components embodying the influences of multiple distinct evolutionary eras and pressures. Of course, fully embracing such a Schelling-inspired Naturphilosophy, reworked in the vein of a secular or even atheistic conflict ontology, and not a more Spinozistic Henkai Pan ontology, entails, among other consequences, repudiating Schelling's own hylozoistic imaginings of nature in its entirety as the harmonious whole of our gargantuan superorganism, unifying and synthesizing each and every one of its parts. Sixth, the conflict ontological philosophy of nature just gestured at in point 5 is crucial in relation to any compatibilism along the lines of Schelling's Spinozism of freedom, seeking to blend a naturalistic ontology with a theory of subjectivity of the sort advanced by transcendental idealism. A not causally closed, not thoroughly deterministic nature, this is the idea of nature offered by a Naturphilosophie of negativity, is the ultimate material condition of possibility for the contingent, not predestined, coming to be of cogito-like subjectivity within nature's lone plane of incarnate immanence. There can be nature-emergent free subjects because nature itself does not form inescapable chains of efficient causal determination, precluding in advance the genesis of such freedom. But nature's inner underdetermination is not itself already the subject's self-determination. The former is a necessary but not sufficient condition for the latter. However, in a companion piece to the present text, I show that Schelling again and again, over the many years of his long and winding philosophical journey, directly identifies natural inner underdetermination with subjective self-determination. He does so by reducing human freedom to being nothing other than the resurgence of the supposed freedom of natura naturans, of Spinoza's Deus sive natura as a primordial mega-subject within the field of natura naturata. For Schelling, nature, as physis qua the ground and producer of everything under the sun, always already enjoys full-blown self-determination. This divinized natura is as much the minded architect of creation as the substantial basis of all beings. In Schellingian parlance, it is the archaic subject-object responsible for reality in its entirety. As Lacan would phrase this, the rabbit of autonomous Geist Schelling pulls out of the hat of heteronymous Natur is the one he put there in the first place. Whether this conjuring trick amounts to a bona fide compatibilism is highly questionable. Rather than rendering free spirit compatible with unfree nature, Schelling simply makes the latter vanish, replacing it with free spirit writ large in the guise of Deus sive natura. A real compatibilism inspired by but taking distance from Schelling involves making explicit an implicit distinction between two versions of the unfreedom that could be attributed to an unfree nature. One version, which is likely what springs to most minds when hearing the phrase unfree nature, is nature as causally closed and thoroughly deterministic. But another version is nature as plastic and inner underdeterministic. Insofar as inner underdetermination is not freedom qua self-determination, an inner underdetermined and inner underdetermining nature still would qualify as unfree. Schelling, once more unwittingly enthralled to the dualistic tendencies he regularly denounces as modernity's cardinal philosophical sin, appears to believe that the only alternative to nature as deterministic is nature as free, as itself spontaneous, self-determining agency. He does not consider the third possibility I'm drawing attention to now, namely, nature is unfree qua inner underdeterministic, a material objective nature of natura naturata without natura naturans, originally lacking, but nonetheless allowing for a spiritual subjective freedom as full-fledged self-determination. Seventh, the nature-emergent transcendental subject in its real autonomy is neither a mere conduit for a divine spirit, nor a sterile and illusory epiphenomenal appearance, must be able to react back upon the natural grounds from which it arose. A genuine compatibilism developed in part via an imminent critical passage through Schelling's Spinozism of freedom should be a non-reductive dialectical naturalism, admitting what is nowadays designated as quote-unquote downward causation. Yet the Schelling who regularly reduces subjectivity to Deus sive natura has everything finitely particular, subjects included, amount to unreal expressions or seemings of an infinitely universal one-all, forecloses the dialectical movement back and forth between upward emergence and downward causation, crucial for a non-reductive compatibilist naturalism. Such movement for this Schelling could be only pseudo-movement, the false appearance of different domains interacting within the motionless one-all of a uniform, homogeneous absolute identity. All such dynamics dissolve as mirages for any ontology of Henkai Pan. Eighth, if, as per the preceding, one does not posit the end, the emergence of sapient and spontaneous mindedness and like-mindedness, if one does not posit the end already in the beginning as the oldest fundamental ontological basis of all beings, then the absolute, as taking into account everything and leaving out nothing, can be only an omega and not, a la Schelling, also an alpha. Especially in light of Schelling's and Hegel's philosophical sensitivities to historical and temporal dimensions, the absolute is shaped and reshaped by what is newest under the sun, by what most lately springs into existence that was not there before. This is because, in order to enjoy absoluteness, the absolute has to encompass what becomes and continues to become as the present unfurls into the future, and not just to encompass what was in the past, quote unquote, in the beginning. As Hegel stresses repeatedly, the absolute is solely a result, coming invariably last and visible exclusively with the hindsight of the owl of Minerva. Relatedly, making the absolute an omega, but not also an alpha, heads off problems about why and or how an absolute as alpha ever would take the trouble to appear, dissemble, emanate, express, seem, and so on. Why would an at one with itself homogeneous infinite disrupt and divide itself so as to give birth to reality as humans know it, namely as finite, differentiated, individuated, many-faceted, etc.? Even for Schelling himself on certain occasions, the absolute conceived as a purely self-identical, monochromatic one-all at the origin of all things is a literal non-starter. Nothing starts, nothing proceeds and advances on the basis of what would be the flat zero level of a sheerly indeterminate, undifferentiated ur-totality. Ninth, the absolute, as a result, is not, so to speak, a sort of super moment coming in addition to and merging into a supreme unity, the preceding multitude of moments. The status of quote unquote absolute knowing at the close of Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, properly interpreted, is the model here. For the Hegel of the phenomenology, the absolute as absolute knowing is not a final shape of spirit unto itself, one wherein the plethora of preceding shapes of consciousness and spirit are dissolved into the pure light of a final and complete one or whole. Instead, absolute knowing is a matter of grasping that the network of one-sided positions and perspectives flowing into each other, thanks to each of their dialectics-inducing flaws, is the only real absolute. This network is precisely what Hegel lays out in the main body of the phenomenology, from its opening treatment of quote unquote sense certainty right up to the threshold of absolute knowing. Hegelian absolute knowing amounts to knowing that the sole absolute is nothing other or more than the patchwork web of inadequate, lopsided vantage points in which these points struggle to compensate for each other's distortions, errors, and oversights. Error and falsity are problematic enigmas, deeply perplexing and troubling for Schellingian radical monism. By contrast, they are the catalysts sparking and engines powering the speculative dialectics of Hegel's philosophy, in which negativity plays the core role. As it turns out, the solution to the mystery of the always already past absolute becoming epistemically estranged from itself. This is Schelling's great puzzle of all puzzles with which I open this intervention. The solution is to make the always just arriving absolute the latest outcome of a concatenation of preceding estrangements, a chain of prior missteps. For Schelling, the organic unity of the one true philosophical system is an appropriate subjective mirroring of the organic unity of all objective reality in and of itself. For Hegel, as well as for many inspired by Hegel, myself admittedly included, The kaleidoscopic collage of partial conceptions, instances, outlooks, representations, views, etc., assembled by the driving negativity of dialectics, fittingly mirrors an existence itself traversed and continually destabilized and disrupted by antagonisms, contradictions, inconsistencies, oppositions, and the like. From this Hegelian perspective, not only do the heterogeneous multiplicity of differences not dissolve in the absolute as the homogeneous unity of identity, the quote unquote night in which all cows are black, the absolute is nothing but the crisscrossing interrelationships between these differences. This heterogeneity displayed by dialectical thinking reflects a heterogeneity inherent to being on sich. These preceding 9 points obviously tip my hand so as to show my primarily Hegelian cards. Without revisiting the intricacies of the fraught Schelling-Hegel relationship, I will end by saying a select few words about this relationship. To begin with, I see Hegel as significantly influenced by Schelling, even long after the two of them become alienated from each other following the publication of Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. To cut a long story short, Hegel, despite his various implicit and explicit criticisms of especially pre-1809 Schelling, carries forward into his mature works a number of commitments, at least partly due to Schelling's influence, including a robust realism affirmed in the teeth of critical transcendental idealisms, subjectivist anti-realism, an insistence on the non-negligible importance of nature, naturalism, and the natural sciences for absolute idealism, a view of Geist as emerging out of Natur through a Befreiungskampf, a struggle for freedom, and a compatibilism synthesizing a naturalistic ontology with a theory of spontaneous transcendental subjectivity. My acknowledgement of these Schelling-indebted features of Hegel's philosophy is at odds with a recent tendency, one featuring prominently in an analytic, philosophical, friendly, deflationary renditions of Hegel, popular in Anglo-American circles, still very popular today, even beyond those circles themselves. This is a tendency indefensible on the basis of the historical record to minimize or deny Schelling's significance for German idealism in general and Hegel in particular. The deflationist stories about Hegel require, in order to maintain a veneer of plausibility, revising Schelling and along with him such figures as Spinoza and Hölderlin out of their narratives about Hegel's formation as a thinker, so as to sustain a dubious rapprochement between Hegel and the anti-naturalism, anti-realism, and subject-centrism of the likes of Kant and Fichte. The deflationists pretend that Schelling has little to no effect on Hegel. This is simply a brazen falsification of intellectual history. It lamentably and irresponsibly sidesteps a philosophically mandatory confrontation with Schelling's and Hegel's multi-pronged critiques of Kant's and Fichte's idealisms. Yet, acknowledging Schelling's lasting effects on Hegel's philosophizing is neither wrongly to portray the mature Hegel as a Schellingian, nor to paper over the many big disagreements between Schelling and Hegel over the arc of their careers. As I readily admit, I see Hegel as possessing the upper hand in his debates with Schelling, and Hegel's version of post-Kantian, post-Fichtean absolute idealism as more philosophically satisfying than Schelling's various positions staked out over the years of his itinerary as a thinker. Nevertheless, apropos such topics as realism, naturalism, and Naturphilosophie, Hegel's advances over Schelling are achieved partly in and through his imminent critical appropriation of and reckoning with the early Schelling's legacy. Indeed, the above 9 points outlining a program for a 21st century reactivation of the earliest system program of German idealism signal the relevance of Hegel, Schelling, and the ambivalences both uniting and dividing these two giants of German idealism for contemporary metaphysics in European philosophical traditions. Traditions they each continue to shape in myriad ways. Thank you. So I want to ask a very small favor. I'm still recovering from a recent bout of bronchitis, and I think I need to get just a little bit more water to drink in order to make sure that my throat doesn't seize up during the discussion. So this will take me but a minute, and then I take it when I return, we can go ahead and open things up to questions, comments, etc. Does that sound all right to everyone?
Yes,
right.
sure. Thank you. We'll have time to think about our questions.
Yeah, I'll be back in just a minute or two. Hold on just a sec.
Thank you very much again for your very comprehensive talk. You walked us through many aspects of Schelling's philosophy, and also from all over his extensive oeuvre, really, from the early systems it's also not in Schelling scholarship. It's not something that you can see always, that these connection points are made between different levels or different phases of his systematical thinking. And in your view, especially with this concentration on the error as the epistemological aspect and the evil as the ontological aspect, you could see how there is this one line that is going through his whole trajectory. And I'm opening for questions. If anybody wants to begin directly about what has been, oh yes, Renzo. Yes, I see a hand, please.
Yes, but Scott is before me. Mrs. Scott, you first. That's okay? Okay, well. Thank you very much, Adrian, for your complete lecture and very detailed. I'm very grateful to hear you. I want to make your question referring to the notion of individuation that I seem to take it from, or maybe Simondon taken from Schelling's to he developed his thesis about that. In which sense, I want to make your question referring nowadays how individuation process is constituting today. Because for Schelling, we know she takes nature as a whole organism, if I'm not wrong about that. But today, with technology and technological aspects, the trans-individuation is caught, Stigler, etc., taking this in account that this individuation process, the phases are not they're not anymore they used to be Schelling's or Simondon when they developed their thesis. How you see this aspect in the nature of the notion of nature in Schelling's nowadays? How we taking these whole organisms with these co-constitutions of these organological aspects of technology nowadays? This is my question. Thank you very much, Adrian, again.
Well, thank you for the question. To begin with, in another piece that this is really what I presented today is part of the the larger whole of which this Schelling material is a part. I do even have a text dealing specifically with Simondon's account of individuation and its influence, in certain French philosophical currents that also at some points connect with Schelling as well. I mean, it's no accident that Deleuze was himself a fan of both Simondon and Schelling. And of course, especially apropos Simondon, and then how his work, I think, is carried forward by Bernard Stiegler, who you also referenced, that there are questions, not only about individuation at the, we might say, pre-human level, in terms of how, nature apart from human beings forms individuated entities and events that then call for distinct scientific disciplines to be able to describe their behavior, formulate their laws of interaction, etc. But then when we're talking specifically about human individuation, or what we might also call, in relation to a larger philosophy of nature, the whole issue of anthropogenesis, of the becoming of the human, up to and including not just humans as Homo sapiens, but specifically as possessed of the sort of subjectivity that the German idealists take the modern era, starting with Descartes, to have brought to light, first in the guise of the cogito, for how you account for that. But then this added dimension, which, indeed you might say that you could do a lot of work rereading Schelling's and Hegel's philosophies of nature in conjunction with histories of the science and technology of the time that the two of them were looking at. And there are several good histories in this vein. I mean, in fact, the three main books in English on this would be Robert Richards' The Romantic Conception of Life, John Zamido's, I think it's entitled The Gestation of German Biology, and then most recently, Joan Steigerwald's Experimenting at the Boundaries of Life. Those three really more history of science, technology, and of the entire intellectual climate of the German-speaking world from in the 18th and early 19th centuries. Armed with that sort of scholarship, revisiting the details of Schelling's and Hegel's philosophies of nature, you might be able to get some mileage there in terms of what they perhaps might agree with apropos the role of technology in a certain sense in human individuation and reconfiguring our relationship to nature. I mean, with Hegel, this often shows up too in some of his manuscript material that was not published until long after not only his, but Marx's death, that involves an anticipation of Marx's emphasis on the role of instruments, machinery, etc., in the labor process and everything connected with it. But that would involve a lot of legwork, a lot of educated guessing, etc. And so I do think it's to the credit of authors such as Simondon and Stiegler to, have really much more brought this to the fore. And what I should also say is that, for my own project, so one of the things that I'm working on right now is the third and final volume of this 3-volume project, the first 2 volumes of which have already appeared, the Prolegomena to Any Future Materialism. And I consider not so much technology, but really more present best natural science in several fields. And then the uptake of some of this, especially in Anglo-American analytic philosophy of mind and metaphysics. I'm very interested in looking at how empirical experimental natural science of recent vintage also is indeed very crucial to engage with in the spirit of Schelling. I mean, really to repeat what he did in 1796, where he went and actually took various university courses from prominent German natural scientists and just absorbed as much as he possibly could in terms of what was then the cutting edge of the natural sciences. And that it's no accident that in particular Schelling was drawn through his studies of this empirical material to work on what you might describe as the physics of these new energies and forces. And of course there Schelling is doing this in a way that's very similar to what Lenin famously objects to in 1908's Materialism and Empirio-Criticism, where you had a number of philosophers latch onto the early 20th century crisis of physics and the toppling of the Newtonian paradigm, and latch onto especially the physics of the extremely small in terms of the quantum revolution, to say that, well, at the most basic level, matter is not even material anymore. It dematerializes itself into something that's much more subject-like, spiritual, intangible, kinetic, etc. And already, that sort of gesture apropos the quantum revolution in the early 20th century, really you see the same thing with Schelling at the end of the 19th century in terms of, his utilization of things like work on, electricity, galvanism, magnetism, etc., to try and make similar claims. In the mid 1790s, Schelling, I think, is still trying to stay very close to the empirical, experimental, natural, scientific material. I think he then, as careful in terms of remaining engaged with those disciplines to further flesh out his account of individuation. He instead seems to shift into the register of, figurative language, metaphor, theosophical speculation, etc. Whereas what I would like to do is something, closer to what I think Hegel already tries to do with Schelling's approach to the philosophy of nature, but in a way that avoids going down the paths he saw Schelling, heading down after the late 1790s. And that would require, this is where these are tasks for a general intellect and not just single researchers. I've not done as much work myself on the technological dimensions of this, but certainly, scientific accounts to, human biology, to the central nervous system, to the evolution of all of this, especially the more biological material of recent vintage. This is absolutely crucial to my own approach to these issues. But, as for the additional technological dimension, I don't know if I'll be the one to tackle that or not. There's work that's being done in these ways, but I see what I'm doing as, not at all incompatible with that as a further dimension that would have to be done justice to here. I think I can more indirectly deal with it through the Marxist components of my work, that look at, how, among other things, the technology that's part of modes of production, of course, has an impact on the kinds of subjects that are going to be formed within given social configurations. But I feel I've gone on rather long at this point, so I should probably stop and open things up to the next question, but thank you.
Thank you. Shall we then move to Scott? And sorry again if I didn't.
No problem.
Your hand.
Thank you for the paper. That was fascinating and super interesting in a whole bunch of ways. So I'm going to do the thing where I relate it to what I happen to be researching now, but which I think at least is not irrelevant. But I'm interested to hear what you think about that. So I was particularly struck by your emphasis on error as a kind of definitively humanizing process or moment in a process of humanization, and on the sort of resources Schelling might offer to recover an indeterministic philosophy of nature and the relationship between those two, right?
Yeah.
So then I also like the attempt to correct the brazen falsification of intellectual history by erasing Schelling from Hegel. But there is a tendency, I think, in both Hegel and Schelling to brazenly falsify intellectual history in their characterization of Spinoza in particular. So, and mostly, I think you were mentioning and citing their characterization of Spinoza as a monist. But some of you seemed to veer into asserting or endorsing it. So the first part of my question is just, do you actually endorse it? Because I think it's demonstrably false that he was not a monist. Like, he literally says it a bunch of times, that God is not one because quantity doesn't apply, for example. And nature, substance, is not one because quantity doesn't apply at that level. And I think this gets a little bit more kind of compelling and clear if you look at Spinoza's specific genealogy and look, for example, at Gersonides, who was, in addition to being, a theologian and super commentator on Averroes, a practicing mathematician and astronomer. So his cosmology was quite concrete. He even invented specific, new tools for it. And he actually has a passage in his super commentary on Averroes' commentary on the De Anima, where he characterizes error as the distinctively human distinguishing feature as contrasted with other animals. And then similarly, Averroes, on whom he's commenting, it's been recently argued, and this is a bit more complex, probably too complex to go into, already has an indeterministic, atomistic reading of Aristotle's physics as perverse as that sort of sounds. And so when you see Spinoza in kind of this genealogy, as opposed to the shadow that German idealism sort of casts back on him, then there's all sorts of interesting ways in which he and the tradition he's working from already anticipate what the German idealists, and especially Schelling and Hegel, take themselves to be doing that's new, and correcting Spinoza's errors and his static absolute and all that stuff. So I'm just curious if that enters into your research project at all.
Yeah, there's a lot that can be said here. You know, I would say that I think some of the Schellingian, especially Hegelian criticisms of Spinoza do actually hit the mark. Others might be somewhat unfair, but at the same time can be understood as fair within the parameters of how the figure of Schelling was being used polemically, rhetorically, argumentatively, et cetera, in the intellectual ethos surrounding basically Kant, and then the controversy, the Spinozism or pantheistic controversy that was triggered starting in 1785 by Jacobi's anti-Enlightenment intervention and his criticisms of various modern philosophers, including and especially Kant. And of course, when you look at what was at stake in the German-speaking philosophical world in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, in light of it being first and foremost Jacobi who put Spinoza back at the center of discussions and debates amongst European philosophers on the continent at the time. There, of course, the big issue would be the idea that ultimately, and this is how, as you know, Jacobi uses the figure of Schelling. I'm sorry, Spinoza. That Jacobi wants to force, his readers to have to choose between either a rationally airtight philosophical system, but if you achieve that, then according to Jacobi, you will end up recapitulating 1677's The Ethics. And there are reasons you might not want to do that. But of course, for Jacobi, all thoroughly consistent, consequent, rational, secular philosophizing of a modern sort would ultimately have to end up adhering to the metaphysics that Spinoza lays out in his magnum opus. And for Jacobi, why do we not want to do that? Because according to Jacobi, Spinoza's ethics is, among other things, a deterministic, fatalistic, hence Jacobi introducing this term that has long history in continental philosophy ever after, nihilistic metaphysics. And that in order to hold on to what is dearest to us, namely human freedom, that we have to reject modern, secular, rationalistic, systematic philosophizing. So we are presented by Jacobi with a supposed forced choice between freedom or system. You can't have both. And then, of course, we can see the entirety of post-Kantian German idealism, including its big three, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel, all concerned at various points in their careers with attempting to rebut Jacobi and to show that, no, this is a false forced choice, and that indeed we can have a system of freedom, as it were. And, of course, you see this in Schelling and Hegel especially, and in Schelling, of course, it shows up in the guise of, looking to combine a philosophy of nature that does, justice to the more monistic sensibilities of something like Spinozism, but then on the other hand, a transcendental philosophy that is able to affirm in the teeth of this sort of ontology, the persisting, the genesis and persistence of spontaneous, self-determining, sentient and sapient subjectivity of the sort that's at the center of transcendental idealism, all of the likes of Kant and Fichte. And so it's really, in terms of Spinoza's monism, it's specifically the deterministic implications of it, the consequences for our views of human freedom, I think, that are the biggest catalysts for worry and work amongst the post-Kantian idealists. And, I do think that as far as that side of Spinoza goes, I mean, he does indeed voice, certain very deterministic views, and that for Spinoza, the greater my sense of individual agency as a self-determining being distinct from other beings, the greater my sense of that, the greater really my ignorance of the sum total of, causes and relations that converge upon me, insofar as I am part of this one single, integrated, field of inseparable from each other entities and events, that makes up the tapestry of attributes and their modes, that is what we encounter initially as reality, and that Spinoza claims as, the expression of a single soul substance, as God/nature or as the infinite. And so I think the determinism charge is, and the fact that Spinoza features as a determinist in these debates is not entirely inaccurate. Another thing that my work, especially the second half of what I presented today, gets at is that there's also with Spinoza this, what Schelling very clearly takes on board, this distinction between two senses of nature, right? Natura naturans, natura naturata. So you have productivity and product, that for Schelling, it's precisely this distinction that licenses him, for instance, to declare a certain degree of the independence of naturphilosophy as speculative physics from the mundane grinding toil of ordinary science in terms of empirical experimental work, which is concerned strictly with natura naturata, as noble a posteriori, but not in the a priori mode of metaphysical speculation. And I do think there are serious, I think that, yes, that distinction is in Spinoza, and it creates, in my view, especially with Schelling, some serious problems, and ultimately is used by him to license, one, his not really needing to have any sense of epistemological responsibility vis-a-vis empirical science, even when he's, cherry picking from them. And secondly, also allows Schelling to engage in what is essentially a kind of panpsychism, in which he, picking up on certain aspects of Spinoza, although of course Spinoza, here this is somewhat unfair because Spinoza says we absolutely cannot anthropomorphize what he calls, Deus sive natura, that any anthropomorphization of this is itself problematic. But Schelling wants to argue instead that, well, we are the resurgence within natura naturata of this primal natura naturans, and that manifests especially as human freedom. And that because of this link, we can also say that natura naturans is this sort of cosmic mega subject, this sort of spiritual organism that runs the show. And once you veer off in those directions, I mean, you're in the swamps of panpsychism and it also indicates that although Schelling, because of his work, especially in the philosophy of nature, is often latched onto by successors as a kind of a sort of closet materialist within the confines of German idealism, is not really the case. He's really, in my view, the ultimate faux ami, the false friend of materialism, and that what he uses certain aspects of Spinoza to end up with something that is, much more spiritualistic and anti-materialist, and yet, presenting it in the guise of a doctrine about nature, etc. There are those, Spinoza, however fair or unfair to him, there is that distinction there, which I think can be capitalized on in the way someone like Schelling does, that creates certain problems if indeed it is used in that way. And the one other thing that I should say apropos Spinoza. So, of course, another of his famous claims is that the truth is the index of both itself and the false. And if I'm right about how Schelling handles the problem of error, and what's interesting too is that when Schelling does alight upon the problem of error and engages in reflections related to how he treats that problem, he often does so with an awareness that, going too far in the direction of what he takes Spinozism to be will create these epistemological difficulties. And I think that we have to recognize that Schelling's alighting upon error as a serious problem is consonant with that side of himself that is worried that this Spinoza's legacy, at least as it features in post-Kantian idealism, might create certain difficulties that are real embarrassments that, no epistemologically responsible philosopher would want to be found unable to get to grips with. But when it comes to Spinoza's idea of the truth being the index of both itself and the false, with Schelling, it's almost as though, for truth in our sense to even be operative, we first have to have the fall into falsity in terms of the estrangement from, from being, substance, nature, et cetera. And only after that lapse, do we then have problems about the very difference or the distinction between the true and the false. And so in a way, it's almost as though there's an implicit kind of reversal here of Spinoza that Schelling is carrying out when talking about error, which is almost to make error, is a way the index of itself and, the non-erroneous, because, and so, and of course, one can see there the connections to the ethical dimensions of his appropriation of biblical narratives of the fall, where, first there has to be sin before there could be redemption, etc. So those are just a few thoughts, but yeah, I mean, I think that there are aspects to Spinoza that involve a kind of radical monism, of a sort that I do think deserve some of the criticisms that Schelling and Hegel launch against it. If you're interested in my account of especially Hegel, Spinoza critique, and then the relative Hegel's contemporary. My 2000 attempts to defend Spinoza against Hegel, or the implicit and explicit role of Spinoza in Deleuzian new materialisms, or in something like Ian Hamilton Grant's work on speculative, revisiting the disagreements between the later German idealists and Spinoza, or at least Spinoza's legacy, or Spinoza as a figure in post-Kantian circles, has a lot of payoffs for assessing the plausibility of contemporary metaphysical approaches or positions that are very much a part of our current intellectual landscape. But yeah, again, I realize I've probably gone on a little too long, but there's no simple answer. But I do think that Spinoza cannot be entirely inoculated against German idealist criticisms of it.
Thank you. That was
So now we can go back to Carl, because you also wrote your question in the chat. So would you like to just voice it yourself? Or
Yes. I thought I would not go into this first, but then the discussion took a turn, so I felt it would be interesting anyway. Essentially, what I wonder is really how the question of fidelity to intellectual history when we philosophize, and with particularly with regard to contemporary issues and problems in philosophy. I take, for instance, a great sort of merit of your 2019 book is to sort of recast some of these problems that you're talking about now through the history of philosophy. So in that sense, very sort of, I can sort of have an intuition about an answer that you might give, but it would be interesting to hear sort of, what is at stake in the question of fidelity, and sort of how do we use, almost like what do you think is best practice in using intellectual history to sort of get a grip on contemporary philosophical problems, to put it simply, I guess.
Yeah. Oh, well, thank you for this. It's a really interesting big picture question. And yeah, you mentioned the 2019 book, the second volume of the Prolegomena project, and that indeed, I use a primarily historical narrative going from Hegel through the Marxist tradition on through psychoanalysis and up to contemporary philosophy, including Anglo-American work on the analytic side of things. That the best way I can begin answering this question is to say that for me, history of philosophy is itself also philosophy, and that might sound like an unenlightening and very banal statement, but it's one that doesn't go without saying, because it's certainly the case that in many groups of professional academic philosophers, there is a sense of a strict distinction between, there are those who do philosophy. I mean, especially if we're talking about English-speaking analytic philosophy, there's a sense of, there are those who do philosophy, and that is working on problems in the present without routing one's claims, arguments, etc., through references to predecessor figures. And that, from this perspective, that's philosophy. But then if you're going to be writing about authors from the past, movements and orientations, that were influential at earlier stages, but have now just become part of the historical record, you're not doing philosophy. You're doing a kind of a specialized sort of intellectual history of interest to philosophers, but not philosophy itself. And I reject that way of dividing things as artificial and false. I think that the temporality of philosophy is such that it often takes centuries, millennia, or might even never happen, that given questions are actually satisfactorily answered or laid to rest. And so so often I find that in going back to certain historical origins for given problems that I'm working on, that there's material to be found in the original sources that is as relevant today, or that it has insights that need to be redeployed that have been forgotten, that should re-inform how we are discussing these matters at present. And indeed, and for instance, the example that 2019 book, revisiting the elements contained in German idealism, in Marxism, in psychoanalysis, etc., for what I'm interested in doing as a kind of contemporary metaphysical project. I feel like I very much made the case in there that especially these aspects of these orientations that have been eclipsed by our recent sensibilities. Indeed, when you think about, I mentioned, with German idealism, these currently very popular, I would say, academically, professionally dominant deflationary interpretations of German idealism, in which Schelling is basically treated as an aberration to be set aside, that his interests in things like a philosophy of nature, et cetera, are outliers with regard to the larger project of German idealism as a global orientation, and that a certain, especially if we're talking about the Pittsburgh-Chicago axis, a certain Salarzian reconstruction of the Kant-Fichte-Hegel relationship is really the key to German idealism. And when you look at that, it's of course that's being put forward in part, although the authors, depending on who they are and at what moment, will sometimes alternate between saying, oh, well, this is actually history of philosophy. This is an accurate reconstruction of German idealism. But sometimes they make clear that no, it's a matter of given discoveries since then, given, for instance, Frege's revolution in logic, or given the insights of someone like Sellers, et cetera, what would a viable form of German idealism in the contemporary setting informed by these other developments look like? And that in my view, this is a revisitation of German idealism on the basis of very careful history of philosophy scholarship reveals, one, that this is not even an accurate historical picture, but also I think importantly too, and this is where it becomes philosophy, not just history of philosophy, that the questions that figures like Schelling and Hegel are struggling to ask and answer apropos things like nature and the natural sciences, that those have been ignored by this way of reading the history here, and that when we cease ignoring them and actually reckon with this material too in their text, we find that there are questions that are not being asked, let alone answered, in our present philosophical conjuncture that are not defensively able to be ignored, written off, treated as just simply outdated, as mere history in that contained, quarantine sense of totally in the past, not relevant to the present. And moreover, like at the start of that 2019 book, in terms of method, I even indicate that here, even though Brandom is one of the guilty parties in terms of the deflationary rendition of especially Hegel, that Brandom's way in, for instance, his 2002 book, Tales of the Mighty Dead, of talking about, all right, well, he has his own position, his inferentialism, And then he can further develop it by going back to various figures in the history of philosophy and looking at how this strange grouping, because it does make for an odd set of bedfellows, that when one constructs the history behind one's contemporary position, that it also sheds light on it, retroactively illuminates connections there in the history of philosophy that previously had not been appreciated until the later advent of this subsequent position, right? And so, for instance, Brandon's inferentialism brings to light a constellation of connections between disparate historical figures in the Western canon that previously we didn't see, or we didn't see them connected in this way or connected at all. And I'm trying to also demonstrate something similar with my own position, which is that, all right, the sort of, what I'd call either transcendental materialist or dialectical naturalist sort of ontological picture I've been assembling over the years, that in terms of further fleshing it out, going back to the history enables me to do that, but it also enables me to show that there are elements at play already in the prior philosophical history that call for these moves in ways that we hitherto haven't appreciated. And so this, in a way, I've, in a long-winded fashion, kind of said that, in a sense, I try to put the two in constant interaction with each other so that the history of philosophy informs the present philosophizing, but the present philosophizing allows us to see things that were there in the history that we couldn't appreciate before. And this double movement, is really, for me, the optimal virtuous circle to try and sustain in terms of having both the history of philosophy and contemporary philosophizing be in a way inseparable from each other, while recognizing that sometimes we may need to do some disambiguation to say, okay, here I'm making a claim about just how to understand at a historical exegetical level what philosopher X is saying, versus, here, whether or not this is correct, this position is attributed to figure X. And insofar as it's still being, used by people today in staking out positions, how are we to evaluate it? And so in this way, your question also is fortuitous, coming after the previous one, in terms of thinking about, all right, for instance, how would a historical figure like Spinoza be handled within the parameters of this way of straddling the line between contemporary philosophy and history of philosophy?
Thank you very much. As I think it was Deleuze who said it, every painter recapitulates the history of painting in his or her own way. And I think that applies to philosophy too, is what you're saying.
Yes, that's right. That's absolutely correct. And, you also, Foucault similarly has this idea of how he did history. It's always a kind of critical ontology of the present, right? That those sorts of sentiments that Foucault and Deleuze voice are very, and then, as I would suggest, weirdly enough, a very non-Deleuzean, non-Foucauldian fellow like Robert Brandom weirdly has a certain version of this himself as well. And I would definitely situate myself in that sort of neck of the woods in terms of my own sense of the relationship between philosophy and its history.
Thank you.
Yeah. I also should say just one more thing with Deleuze too. I mean, his idea as well in what is philosophy of, basically certain proper names like Spinoza, Kant, etc., functioning to designate not even so much, flesh and blood historical figures, but also at the same time, what he nicely describes as conceptual persona, populating this plane on which philosophers operate, where in some ways, the dead are not really dead for us and remain, very much live, conversation partners. And, although that's a very simplistic way to put it, I can't help but feel that way, to feel that going back and trying to converse with figures like Spinoza or Hegel is it feels as timely and alive as talking to anybody flesh and blood.
I was thinking it also makes sense with what you said about the absolute in Schelling, that it updates itself with each movement. And again, if philosophy is the philosophy of the absolute, then also with the history of philosophy, the whole trajectory changes again. We have another hand, but I wanted to use my moderator privilege and ask my questions first, and then to Soroush. So I had a couple of questions. The most important maybe about the when you were talking about Schelling's critique of Fichte as an anti-naturalist thinker, and then bringing Spinoza, and especially also in the freedom essay. I was waiting to see what you think about the connection between nature and the figure of Ungrund, or then later the Urgrund, this non-ground, which is a kind of nothingness. So at the same time that Schelling is trying to think nature positively, we have always this parallelism between the nature in God or the nature in absolute as a form of nothingness, because again, anything that comes into existence is already the part of existence and not the Grund. And so this is one question, one part of the question, and then the other one is on the Weltalter aspect. When you are talking about the absolute, I will just give you the both questions. The absolute or the beginning as the omega, as the one that comes at the end. And I was wondering if you can see also a possibility to read, if let's say it like this, if we read this absolute as the omega in the temporality of the Weltalter itself as a nonlinear temporality, then the whole distinction between omega and alpha doesn't make sense in that way, because it's not a linear narration of the absolute. It's more like a spiral. So the omega again becomes the alpha at the same time, or it is a beginning at the end, but it is a beginning. And to me personally, this whole Schellingian critique of the linear temporality and the Newtonian absolute space is part of his critique of the modern sciences in general. And again, this distinction that you also mentioned between natural sciences and the other aspects of the system.
Yeah. No, this is great, and also this gives me a chance, because even Sepid, some of what you said right at the start when we got ready to open up the discussion, there were a few things that popped to mind, and given that you yourself are working on Schelling, I'm hoping that some of these additional remarks will be appreciated. I can say that with Schelling, one of the things that I try and do, especially in the much longer version of the text that I extracted this talk from, is to, as anyone who works on Schelling knows, one of the biggest bones of contention between various Schelling scholars, and something that keeps them all quite busy, is the question of, how to periodize Schelling's intellectual itinerary. And that, often when people are talking about Schelling, they feel the need to, at a minimum, say whether they're discussing early Schelling, middle Schelling, late Schelling. But there are, in addition to, this rather simplistic early, middle, late periodization, there are other competing models. And, in this work, I'm also, adding to this ongoing discussion, and arguing essentially that neatly periodizing Schelling's development isn't possible. That in fact his protean character, his mercurial nature as a thinker, what led Hegel in his Berlin lectures on the history of philosophy to rather nastily describe Schelling as being guilty of conducting his philosophical education on the public stage, that in fact there's such volatility or instability to Schelling that even within single texts, let alone within single supposed periods, you can find him saying things that really ultimately can't be squared with each other, that are incompatible. But then you can see how subsequent works will run with certain aspects rather than others. Those that don't get developed in those works get developed, elsewhere. And for me, it was a matter of, in particular, looking at. So of course, when Schelling talks about the absolute as identity with a capital I, and we have to bear in mind that he develops his Identitäts philosophy during the same period in which he is still also very invested in Naturphilosophy. Schelling, of course, when, and you mentioned also Sepid, his critique of Fichte, right? And that, one of the things I point out is that at those moments when Schelling feels the need to establish maximal distance between himself and Fichte. So, obviously 1801's presentation of My System of Philosophy, also the 1806 critique of the revised Fichtean doctrine, and other texts as well, where Fichte is either an explicit or implicit target of Schelling's polemics, that at the moments at which Schelling seeks to distinguish himself as vehemently anti-Fichtean, that's when he tends to most firmly embrace Spinozistic monism, and where the figure of Spinoza, is his kind of palate cleanser vis-a-vis the influence of Fichte on him in his youth. I think that, here, again, the idea of Spinoza as the kind of anti-Fichte is far from unfair, even to Spinoza, historically speaking. And I think Fichte was quite right to discern Spinoza as one of his nemeses, in terms of his own version of transcendental idealism. But without getting too bogged down in that, I should say that when you start tracking the different contextual factors like the anti-Fichtean polemics that are shaping Schelling's thinking, sometimes he will emphasize that identity, pure, undiluted, monistic oneness, and to go back to that earlier question about Spinoza, although, Spinoza says we can't talk about substance as a one in a mathematical sense, given that it is not capturable by, mathematical quantification. That nonetheless, there is this emphasis on a kind of primordial unity in a way where, Spinoza himself can be seen as part of, within the Western tradition, a kind of radical monistic tendency that goes back to a figure like Parmenides, is also prominently on display with Neoplatonists such as Plotinus. And then, also, I think, not without justification, someone like, Schelling, but also Hegel see in Spinoza. But anyhow, that, you have on the one hand, this Schelling who is more, Iliadic, Neoplatonic, Spinozistic, who emphasizes the primacy of this identity and as both an alpha and an omega. And then a Schelling who talks about difference. Now, of course, we have the famous slogan of the identity of identity and difference that Hegel first coins in 1801's difference between Fichte's and Schelling's system of philosophy. And Schelling, during this period in which he and Hegel are together in Jena collaborating, Schelling latches onto and makes his own, starting in 1802's Bruno dialogue. But then when you look at the interplay between identity and difference, my argument would be that the full arc of Schelling's intellectual itinerary from 1793 until his death in 1854, what you see is that there's this constant unstable oscillation, and that generally, I would say in the majority of instances, identity wins out over difference, that overall Schelling prioritizes identity and the absolute as at one with itself. But then there are these other moments where the side of difference gets its due. And I would argue that the first places you see this happen are in, for instance, the late 1790s, particularly in On the World Soul, and then his first outline of a system for the philosophy of nature. That what you get is a Schelling who, in that context, takes the Kant of 1786's Metaphysical Foundations of Natural Science and says, all right, there Kant makes the mutual conflict between attractive and repulsive forces the ultimate basis, the kind of foundation for the transcendental reconstruction of natural science, and hence of the picture of the natural world involved with such science. And what Schelling does is, in a way, ontologizes what Kant handles there in an epistemological mode, and then presents not a Parmenidean but a much more Empedoclean outlook, according to which at the basis of all being is the negativity of conflict, that discord is primordial, and that thanks to such primordial discord, we have a series of interactions which generates the complexity and diversity, the array of various differences that makes up the multicolored tapestry of reality as we know it, right? And that's more his conflict as opposed to Henkai Pan ontology that I talked about. And so with the periodization picture, for me, it's that there's an inconsistent oscillation across the full arc of Schelling's work, between prioritizing identity or prioritizing difference as ontologically ultimate. And that this then allows us a very different way for, I think, interpreting Schelling, not only during certain stretches of years, but even within given texts, right? And so this would be, and it would be a model where there isn't a linear progression through distinct stages or phases, but instead is, I mean, it's much closer to how Jean-Francois Marquet in his 1968 study on Schelling that was, I don't think it's ever been translated into English out of French, but Marquet's way of reading Schelling, although it's not the same as mine, it does share that idea of, no, Schelling, there were certain basic philosophical difficulties as conflicts between competing perspectives that obsessed him. And he keeps going back to these unresolved problems, and that's generative of the movement of his thought. And I think that something like that is the better picture of him. Then you've got early Schelling, middle Schelling, late Schelling, and then maybe refinements of that model, but that's that. Now, that's what I wanted to say apropos your opening remarks, but to get to the questions that you asked. So apropos this notion of the Ungrund from the 1809 Freiheitsschrift, that's one of the first things that you brought up. So I should begin by putting my cards on the table and saying that I interpret the distinction between ground, Grund, and existence in the Freiheitsschrift as a terminological variation on the Spinozistic Natura Naturans, Natura Naturata distinction. Right, if you look at how that Spinozistic distinction features in Schelling's pre-1809 writings, and then how he talks about the ground difference distinction, the ground existence distinction in the Freiheitsschrift, I think you'll see that there's ample evidence supporting the idea that he is using these words to recast what is central to him in that Spinozistic distinction. One of my hunches for why he terminologically recasted at that point is, as you well know, early on in the Freiheitsschrift, Schelling ties himself in knots trying to recast Spinozism so that it is not vulnerable to things like Hegel's dismissal of the monochromatic abyss of the night in which all cows are black. And we have to remember, right, Hegel's phenomenology, 1806, 1807, Schelling reads it, is, this ruins their friendship. He takes himself and not just his less talented followers to be the targets of those swipes from the Phenomenology's preface. And then 2 years after the Phenomenology appears, we get the Freiheitsschrift. And what is one of the things he's doing early on? Clearly, I think, trying to defang those Hegelian criticisms of his Spinozism, right? And so I think he's also a little wary about appearing too Spinozistic, in part because he was then freshly stung by Hegel's critiques of the more Spinozistic side of his earlier work. Now, how to interpret the Ungrund? Because we have Grund, and then we have and of course, we have both Urgrund and Ungrund. So we have the primordial ground and then groundlessness. And of course, one of the things that I think is really valuable about Schelling, but especially here in the 1809 Freiheitsschrift, is that he also brings out what we might describe as a kind of paradox of the absolute, as both he and Hegel are dealing with it. And the paradox is this, that on the one hand, the absolute would seem to be what is most grounding, right? That it would be, in fact, were we to arrive at a successful articulation of it, we would provide the greatest amount of systematic philosophical grounding or foundation possible. That knowing the absolute would be to know what is most grounding of all that is. And so there you would have the absolute as the Urgrund, right? It's the primordial ground, the ultimate ground, the ground of all other grounds and grounding. But of course, when we think about something as ground, as a firm basis, whether in a material or in a conceptual, argumentative sense, right? We think of that which is maximally justified, but especially since Grund also involves the idea of reason and giving the reason for as the grounds of. And for both Hegel and Schelling, but especially for this Schelling in a very explicit way in 1809, when he associates the Urgrund with the Ungrund, right, the primordial ground with groundlessness, well, that's because for us at least, when we arrive at, assuming we do arrive at the absolute, we would have this strange experience bringing together apparent opposites, in which on the one hand, we have the sense of reaching the maximum degree of grounding, that which is most grounding and hence also grounded itself as the absolute basis of all else. But then, since there would be nothing more, since there can't, in order for the absolute to be absolute, it can't be supplemented by anything in addition to or outside of itself. It's as though the absolute would just seem to, hang in midair on its own, mysteriously, it almost goes from seeming like a necessary ground to a contingent esgit, to just a simple, brute givenness of something that doesn't have anything further beyond, behind, or beneath it that justifies it in turn. Right, the ultimate justifier itself would have to be unjustified because no further justifications, given its ultimacy, can be adduced. And so for Schelling, then, I think there's this way in which German idealism, if it were to achieve this full account of everything under the sun with no exceptions and arrive at an idealism that's truly absolute in the strongest senses of the absolute, that it would combine the sense of ultimate ground with utter groundlessness. Right, and so you have that, that motif of the Ungrund as tied to the Urgrund, and as a very effective means by which Schelling brings out how the apparent opposites of things like, groundedness and groundlessness, reason and lack of reason, necessity and contingency, etc., are all weirdly made to converge when we get to this singularity that is the absolute in the late German idealist philosophical sense. But then there's also this way in which the Grund as Ungrund is very much tied to the problematic sides of the Natura naturans, Natura naturata distinction that I'm pushing back against. And it's where, for Schelling, human freedom, we can see it as the return of not just the ground, but of the ground precisely as both grounding, self-grounding, and hence groundless within the field of constituted existence. And this is where we get to, because you mentioned a spiral. And in a companion piece to this, I talk about Schelling's, if Schelling and Hegel can also be thought of in relation to philosophies of nature and the natural sciences as proto-emergentists. And it's interesting, like Anglo-American philosophers and cognitive scientists dealing with the study of emergence always trace it back to, John Stuart Mill and developments in English-speaking philosophy from the late 19th century onward. But certainly, I think Schelling and Hegel are both arguably earlier forefathers, proto-emergentists, even more so than some of the figures who are often pointed to by the analytic genealogy of emergentism that doesn't go back as far historically. But if we think about them as both Schelling and Hegel as both emergentists or proto-emergentists, whereas Hegel has something which is closer to what is more common also nowadays amongst emergentists, a kind of layer cake model, right? Where you have, if we follow the linear narration of the second volume of the encyclopedia, Hegel's own Naturphilosophy, we basically go from mechanical physics, through chemistry to organic chemistry, biology, through zoology, and then we move into Geistesphilosophy, the philosophy of mind or spirit, as volume 3 of the encyclopedia. You have more of a layer cake model with Hegel, the more linear one. With Schelling, you get what I describe as a layered donut, right? Where you have the first layer, which is this Natura naturans as this primordial self-grounding, hence groundless Grund. Then it gives rise to these intermediate levels and layers in terms of Natura naturata or existence. And then finally, at the peak of that for Schelling is the emergence of anthropogenesis, the emergence of human beings. And in and through human beings, the primordial self-grounding, hence groundless freedom of the Urgrund as Ungrund resurfaces within existence in and through human freedom. And so there, it's like the last layer of the dessert is the first layer too, and hence the ends meet, and you have a layered donut as opposed to a layered cake. But with these dessert metaphors, what I'm trying to capture there is that also we can see with just this visual metaphor why I think there's this problem of pseudo explanation where explaining in a compatibilist mode and in line with the ambitions of Schelling and Hegel to formulate a Spinozism of freedom, to combine something like Spinoza with Kant and Fichte, that in a way, Schelling kind of cheats because it's in a way easy, like as I say with reference to Lacan, the rabbit you pull out of the hat is one you put there to begin with. Well, if I just posit a kind of subjectivity and a spontaneous self-determining subjectivity at the basis of all being, well, accounting for human spontaneous subjectivity is a lot easier because then I can just recast it as, oh, it's just us reconnecting with that primordial ground. I think that, you know, and of course, it also involves spiritualizing nature at the most fundamental level, saying the basis of all being is something really that's more like a minded subject. And there even I'd say Spinoza would object. I mean, Spinoza is, you know, takes great pains to avoid anthropomorphizing what he calls Deus sive natura, whereas Schelling seems less caught up in that. But then the last thing, though, you asked about was also, you mentioned the Weltalter, you know, and of course, as my talk indicated, you know, I think it's particularly in the third and final draft of that, the 1815 manuscript, where Schelling really is most fully, you might say, Empedoclean, you know, most embracing of a conflict ontology, and hence is, you know, I think most amenable to a friendly appropriation by me, by contrast with the more identitarian, radically monistic, you know, more, you know, standardly Spinozistic Schelling. But yeah, I mean, you're right, of course, it's not a linear narrative. You know, one has to take into account that when Schelling talks about past, present, and future, and of course, he only managed to write drafts of the past and not to talk about the epochs of the present and the future, he's not talking about points along the linear chronological arrow of time, right? I mean, he's talking about, like, you know, what, in a way, Schelling's past is not a prior now point, but it's something that preceded what we experience as the entire era covered by the time in the form of the linear chronological time of the arrow of time, right? And so that, yes, that presents some complications. But what I think is appealing about the Weltalter is that it involves Schelling working out this realization that if, you know, if God, with what he calls God in the Weltalter, we're closer to something like whether the Plotinian one that, you know, for whatever reason that we don't know deigns to emanate, you know, or something like a certain version of Spinoza's idea of infinite substance. If God were like this, why would God ever bother to engage in the act of creation? Why would God, in a way, separate himself from himself by creating this divide between himself and his creation? You know, what would lead to this? And it seems as though Schelling is there, painfully aware that God, in a way, has to be internally divided. God has to be, in a way, at war with himself to have, you know, to be prompted to, in an effort to tame and domesticate this inner turmoil that Schelling very poetically describes, to try and eject out of himself, you know, certain elements and set them up in opposition so as to gain some distance from them. Even if we think that that's much too figurative, poetic, theosophical, etc., I think in a way it still stages or conveys very powerfully Schelling's awareness that the more Eleatic, Neoplatonic, or Spinozistic sort of Henkai Pan-ontology he's been working with is, as I put it, a literal non-starter, and that to really account for the world as it is, we need a radically different picture of the ground of being that involves positing primordial, you know, irresolvable, unsynthesizable conflict as part of our picture of even the most basic levels and layers of being. And that I greatly appreciate, you know, apropos the Weltalter Schelling. But then, I mean, even after that, later, he seems to forget, you know, some of his own best insights and to return to something closer to the Henkai Pan as opposed to the conflict ontology in his later work, including up through his Berlin period teaching. So yeah, he's a frustrating, but because of that, also fascinating figure to work on. But yeah, hopefully this went some way towards answering some of this. But I should also say that, yeah, for Schelling, I think the Weltalter shows that he was aware that the absolute as identity can't be an alpha, you know, at a minimum. That instead our picture of the alpha, and hence of that side of the absolute we associate with alpha, has to be very different from, you know, for instance, standard, you know, theological or you know, certain philosophical depictions of the basis of all being.
Yes, thank you so much. Yeah, you lightened up many aspects of both Freiheitsschrift and the Weltalter. I can say a lot more, but we don't have much time left, so I just let Soroush ask his questions. We have half an hour almost.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. I don't know if my question is quite relevant to your concerns, but I know that you work on many different figures, such as from Žižek to Miyasu, and I follow your work. And there's this question always. I mean, I think this is a very important one. I think we can divide them into two camps. Like, for example, let's consider. I mean, the question of materialism in different camps right now. We have a kind of affirmative Deleuzian, Spinozist materialism, which is like a radical kind of immanence and positivity. And then on the other hand, we have the other camp, the Hegelian, Žižekian camp, even Badiou, which always comes down to this conception of negativity, some necessary kind of the necessity of negativity in ontology, like we see in Žižek, for example, when he talks about ontological incompleteness. As it seems to me, they consider this negativity in the heart of materialism or their philosophical system to be a necessary condition for implementing freedom and democracy and politics even. But then at the same time, we have this other camp of immanentist, let's say, philosophers, which then they have different, they come in different brands. Like we have accelerationism in land, and then we have Deleuze and other people. So since you were talking about Spinoza, and I really loved it, what do you think is the answer? I mean, I know this is a very ridiculous question to be asking, but what do you think? Where do you stand? I mean, since you're an expert in all of these thinkers, where do you stand personally? I mean, I'm not really convinced of either of the two options, whether to go for negativity, Sartrean, Žižekian negativity, or for Deleuzian and Spinoza's affirmation. So and accelerationism. So I mean, and then we have a figure like Miyasu, who I mean, like mixes it all up with the necessity of contingency. So I mean, I don't know if I go further. I guess I'm going to complicate things even more. So thank you very much. But if you can, like, give me an answer to that. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure if I can deliver the ultimate answer you're looking for in terms of what is the single correct position when all is said and done. But I think I can at least go some way towards indicating where I think the most promising paths lie in terms of navigating this terrain populated by this array of different contemporary figures that you mentioned. And I fully agree with your characterization that when it comes to talking about materialism today, that we could begin, that it's certainly defensible to begin by saying that there is this fundamental divide between two camps. Now, there are, of course, differences within each camp as well, and we could refine this. We could spend quite a bit of time refining this, but I won't do so in the interest of more succinctly answering the question. But I think you are quite justified in saying, on the one hand, you have this more Spinozistic Deleuzian current, that often is, associated with what's called "quote unquote" new materialism, and that in addition, I mentioned, Ian Hamilton Grant is explicitly using a Schelling who I think is heavily colored for Grant by a combination of Spinoza and Deleuze. In the guise of, you might say, Deleuze's Spinoza, but both Spinozized and Deleuzianized Schelling, but of course Deleuze and behind him Spinoza remain very important for a number of individuals and orientations that self-identify as materialist or as "quote unquote" new materialist. Versus, on the other hand, the major alternative being a camp that I think you rightly associate with not only Žižek and the Slovene school of Hegelian Lacanianism, but also the work of Badiou. And as you probably won't be surprised to hear, I mean, of course, I'm much closer to and more sympathetic towards the latter camp. That indeed the Žižek, Badiou et al. That is more the neighborhood that I feel at home in, and indeed I am pointedly critical of variants of new materialism and speculative realism that I think are more Spinozistic and or Deleuzian. And if you're interested in that, again, my use of Hegel's critique of Spinoza to also criticize Deleuzian and new materialist approaches today, you'll find in that 2014 book of mine, Adventures in Transcendental Materialism. But then a book from a year prior, the first volume of my Prolegomena project, The Outcome of Contemporary French Philosophy, has lengthy critiques of Lacan, Badiou, and Meillassoux in terms of shortcomings to their own versions of Lacan's ways of talking about materialism, but then especially Badiou and Meillassoux. Here what I would say is that there are two major differences between myself on the one hand and figures such as Žižek or Badiou on the other. First, I actually, despite the fact that indeed a certain Hegel-inspired sense of negativity is crucial to my picture of nature and to the sort of ontology I'm interested in elaborating, I still refuse, though, to make negativity some sort of ultimate alpha that's an unexplained explainer, and where you just posit that in the beginning is the void, negativity, nothingness, etc. And then somehow you get from that to reality as we know it, and then human beings somehow tap back. Again, something like Schelling's layered donut model, and human beings can tap back into this void or nothingness, reactivate this negativity, and that's what's involved in our freedom, etc. That for me, it's that I really start with a picture that is closer to a sort of almost flat-footed, unsophisticated scientific outlook, according to which, in any beginning that we have any epistemological access to, and hence can responsibly speculate about without it just being making things up in the comfort of the philosopher's armchair. For any beginning that we have any kind of epistemological access to, you have this initial, skip, this Iliad, there is of just a plurality of natural entities and events, right? You have a zero level of reality for us that consists of especially inorganic substances and processes. And the challenge is, I think, to get from that as really pre-subjective, and it's not some, having hidden behind it some deeper spiritual subject like X, whether Natura Naturans or Schelling's variations on that, and then of course, ultimately, since this traces back to Spinoza, you get versions of this too, in the new materialist, more Deleuzian inflected spiritualizations of nature, that are very much a part of those discourses. But I think that sometimes people like Žižek and Badiou are too quick to just say that, you have this the X of this negativity, nothingness, void. It is what makes us the sorts of subjects that we are, and on its basis, we explain everything else. But I think that for a perspective that really is informed by, and of course, Badiou is avowedly anti-naturalist about accounting for human subjectivity. Žižek, no. I mean, his case is much more complicated. But for them, they, whether as a matter of principle or just, given the focus of their work, neither of them, for instance, offers an account of how the sorts of negativity involved in human subjectivity could themselves be accounted for as products of natural entities and events and processes that can be dealt with in an epistemologically more defensible fashion at the level of things like scientific explanation. And so for me, I think that you can get back behind negativity and account for the genesis of the sort of negativity crucial to the theories of subjectivity involved in the Žižek, Badiou, et cetera camp. But without having to engage in this mysticism of the void or this appeal to negativity or nothingness as this, again, unexplained explainer, this mysterious X that somehow you could use as a starting point for kind of grounding everything else. And so, a picture of nature without that kind of spiritualization or mysticizing of it, that I think both camps are guilty of in different ways. There's the Spinozistic way of doing it, but there's also a way that I think Badiou and Žižek do it. And how to really avoid that and have a much more, epistemologically justified and scientifically defensible account for anthropogenesis, that where negativity has a place, but where it doesn't function as a godlike, universal, kind of argumentative trump card, in the way I think it sometimes does, with this other camp. So that would be, the beginnings of an answer. It does, I think you can get a lot of what figures like Žižek and Badiou want, but you can get it in a way that doesn't require you in making some very questionable, speculative, apparently ungrounded claims about nothingness, negativity, voids, etc. That, for instance, when Žižek does things like this toward the end of like his work on the pre-Socratics, toward the end of Less Than Nothing, it gets very hard to follow. And I begin to, my philosophical and, more, epistemological and natural scientific side gets very suspicious that here, it's basically figurative language and a lot of opaque jargon that is being deployed in place of an actual, really explainable to, even skeptical or non-expert audiences. How it is that really you are on the one hand a materialist, and hence, as a materialist, you have a certain respect for things like the methodology and epistemology of the sciences that study material nature. And at the same time, you also can have a radically non-reductive account of human subjectivity that captures aspects of the subject as theorized traditionally by idealism in Western philosophy, but able to be done justice to in a materialist manner. So that would be how I position myself in relation to the kind of landscape you sketched out in your question, if that helps.
Thank you very much.
So, if we do not have any other questions, then I thank you again. It was really a journey. Many ghosts of Schelling's past and future came also across the talk, and I think he will be happy. I was thinking also when you were talking about the Weltalter that, and it's absolute, that again, it is a work that is not finished itself. And also in that formal way, and there's a mirroring of, I always would like to think that we are all somehow finishing the Weltalter when we are thinking and talking about this.
I would love to see somebody be crazy and daring enough to try to write the volumes 2 and 3, the present and the future. Hopefully somebody will come along who will have the daring or even chutzpah to make an attempt at doing precisely that. It would be very fascinating to see.
Yeah, don't tempt me. But yes, I agree. And also with all the other aspects, especially this last question, we got a lot of, I think, insights into how we can go further with the issues. And I thank you everyone also who were with us, and also the ones who stayed with us until now. Where I am is now 8:20 in the evening. So again, I wish you a very good day, the rest of the day, whenever it is.
Well, thank you all too. I love the discussion, was really rewarding for me. The questions were great, and I very much appreciate the invitation. It's been a pleasure getting to spend this afternoon, or at least what's afternoon where I am, getting to talk with all of you.